Hello, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. Welcome to this event. This is the second event of the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance Conference, Electrifying Canada's School Bus Fleet, the challenges, lessons learned, and solutions. My name is Jean-Patrick Toussaint, or JP for shorts. I'm the Senior Climate Program Director at the Trottier Family Foundation, and I'll be your host for today's panel discussion, which I'm very excited about, which is about leading electric school bus adoption at a provincial level. Before we start, I do want to acknowledge that I am talking to you from the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa, and it's again my pleasure to welcome you all. All right. Okay, so in a second, I'll be presenting you the agenda, but again, I just want to remind you this is the second event of this from the CESBA on adoption of ESB at the provincial level. So today's agenda and today's event include a short introduction of the Canadian Electric School Buses Alliance, or CESBA, a panel discussion with our two panelists that you can also see on the screen, David McKay and Matt Collins, who I'll introduce in a second, as well as a Q&A session towards the end. There'll also be some concluding remarks. If you do have any questions during the panel discussion, please do write them in the question tab at the bottom right of your screen, and we'll share them orally with the panelists. If you like a question, select the arrow beside it to help us prioritize the most popular questions, so it'll help us sort things out. And for anything else, comments, reaction, links, you can use the chat function. This event is in English, but if you do have, let's say, questions in French, I'd be happy to translate them if you prefer writing them in French. And please also note that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the event. All right. So with this, I'd just like to say a few words about the CESBA, or Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance. Actually, we're celebrating the first anniversary of the CESBA, which was launched last year at the same time. It's a Canada-wide coalition of organizations from environmental NGOs and health association to fleet operators and EV advocacy group, all advocating for policies that accelerate school bus electrification. So we aim to see all Canadian school bus fleets be electrified by 2040 or sooner, as you may have heard or learned about this earlier this week at the first conference event. So to achieve this, we organize events such as this one today we facilitate networking and knowledge sharing among stakeholders. We work on developing strategies and recommendations to accelerate the uptake of electric school buses, both at the federal level, of course, but at the provincial levels of government, and more specifically, of course, in the provinces of Prince Edward Island, as we'll hear about today, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. You also may be interested, if you've not had a chance to join us earlier this week, that CESBA launched a report about pathways for Canadian electric school bus adoption, which can be found on Equiterre's website or soon on CESBA's website. I also want to mention that the Alliance is coordinated by both Equiterre and Green Communities Canada. Okay, so again, just as you can see on this slide, so this second event is the second of four that started earlier this week. There's two more sessions coming up. So until June 8th, a number of speakers and all the themes that will be addressed are listed on the screen. So I invite you again, if you're interested in more, in finding out more, to go to CESBA's website, and you'll be able to find that information. Okay, so for today's event, we'll be focusing on PEI and British, or in BC, I'll go for short. These provinces have shown absolute great leadership in advancing ESB adoption, as they have the largest shares of ESBs in their fleets and can provide inspiration and guidance for other provinces. And this is what we're trying to achieve here. In this session, we'll therefore discuss the current state of electric school buses in each of those provinces with our guests. existing ESB adoption targets, as well as innovative policies and approaches being taken by their respective governments on this file. So we'll hear from policy experts that are with us today. So it's my pleasure to introduce both Matt Collins and David McKay. So we'll start out east with Matt, who's the Manager of Engineering Services with the PEI Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. Matt has been instrumental in the implementation of the electrification of the PEI school bus fleet. He's been quite active, contributing member of the Provincial Sustainable Transportation Action Plan, as well as the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Zero Emission Vehicle Group, the Infrastructure Grid Readiness Working Group within ARCAN, and the Transportation Association of Canada's Technology Council. So quite active on this file, as you can see. Matt was also a contributor to the NRCan Atlantic Climate Adaptation Solutions Manual. So welcome, Matt. Very happy to have you with us today.
Nice to be here.
Our second guest is David McKay, based out west in BC, who's a senior policy analyst working with the Clean Transportation branch within the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Low Carbon Innovation. In this role, David manages and develops funding programs designed to accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. And David is also currently leading the province Clean BC Go Electric School Bus Program, the Go Electric Public Charger Program, and the Go Electric Hydrogen Fueling and Fleets Program. So welcome, David. All right, it's great having you both. Thanks for having accepting our invitations. We'll jump right into our panel discussion. And as I said from the get-go, we'll have a chance to get your questions through the questions tab at the bottom of your screen towards the end of our discussion. If you do have some during as we're exchanging with David and Matt, please feel free to write them down as well. All right, so let's start from the beginning, and with this first slide, I'd like for both you, David and Matt, to give us a bit of a sense of the state of electric school buses. So across the country, if I'm not mistaken, we have about 50,000 school buses, but electric school buses are about less than 1% of Canada of that fleet. So with this context in mind, I'd really like to hear a little bit more. What's the current state of electric school bus adoption in your province? So how many have you got? We'll start west this time. So maybe I'll turn to you, David, first, and then we'll hear from Matt.
Yeah. So BC launched a funding program in 2020 for electric school buses. And the first year, 18 buses were ordered. Currently, there's 57 buses on the road, electric school buses on the road in BC. And since the program launched in 2020, there's 72 buses ordered. That's as of the end of 2022, the calendar year. And so in 2022, there were 18 orders, which represented a 22% adoption rate for the calendar year 2022. And this was a slight drop off compared to the previous year. In the 2021 calendar year, we had an adoption rate of 40% with 34 buses ordered. In terms of the number of electric school buses in procurement now, we can't speak to that at the moment, but we're expecting an increase in the adoption rate. Things looking forward look good for the province.
Great, thanks, David. Maybe we'll have a chance to get back to it later. I'd be curious to also hear more about what explains those fluctuations from one year to the year, but maybe we can come back to that. So maybe I'll turn first to you, Matt, and if you can give us a sense of what's the state of electric school bus adoption in PEI.
So in 2020, we did our first trial with 12 buses, similar to the 14 out in BC. Then we followed up with back-to-back years of orders of 35. The last few buses are trickling in from the last order, so we'll have a total of 82 on the road. And right now, we've got 25 tendered, and the tender's ready to be awarded. We're just waiting for another federal funding agreement to be signed.
Fantastic. So Matt, what does that represent if if you have 82 on the road, if I've jotted down correctly, what
so it's around
percentage?
30%, close to 30% of our
30%
full fleet.
Fantastic, great, thanks. That sets the stage. So we'll move on to the next question then. So, you know, you've told us about the current state. So I'm guessing there are some targets for electric school bus adoption in your province. So maybe we could start again with those. What are those in your provinces? The sub question, as you can see on the screen, like what went into securing the target from your province, and how is that, those targets helped advance the transition to ESB, of course. So we'll start back east now to you, Matt. So you were telling us about this represents about 30% of your fleet. So what's the target?
Well, originally when we started buying them, after the first 12 were purchased, the provincial government announced that we were going to have 100% of the fleet completely switched over in 5 years. But availability and costs have pushed that to 2030 as a more realistic target. Right now, we're committed to buying 25 a year for 5 years, and this is that 25 I told you that's on hold right now for the agreement signature is the first of those 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, then we'll reevaluate what the total number of buses are to be completed. And even though we say 100%, there may be some areas that an electric bus just may not be suitable. Either the range is too long. So it might be 100% of what is capable of being switched over.
Great. So before we dive into a little bit further up, maybe David, can you tell us what's the target in BC?
Yeah. So in BC, there's no like formal target at this time, but right now the province is actually doing work on medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle regulations. And so the province just a couple of weeks ago published a consultation paper that went out to over 1,000 stakeholders. And the proposal is essentially regulating the sales of zero emission, medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles by each manufacturer starting in 2026. And so there's an alignment with the regulations that are in California. And so, yeah, it's kind of a timely question. Like we're working on these regulations now, and yeah, when the consultation period ends at the end of June, we'll look at that feedback and kind of work on it. So nothing formal right now, but I think with electric school buses, the success of the program right now, there's room for targets in BC for electric school buses.
Great. So maybe I'll piggyback on that. So that you said that there's room for target, and I know it's difficult for you maybe, David, because at the moment there's no such target, but there could be. So like I'll ask you the same question, Matt, but what could help with securing a target maybe in BC, or if is with the work that's being done on medium heavy duty vehicles, will a target be necessary, you feel, based on your understanding? And Matt, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what went into securing that 100% target, like originally, like now by 2030. So what are those pieces? So maybe starting again with David and then go back to Matt.
Yeah, I think like targets in general are really helpful, and they drive markets to adopt these these vehicles. So from that perspective, they're really helpful. We're really going to assess like the feedback that we get through this consultation period and make decisions based on that feedback. And so yeah, that's really what I can say to that right now.
Great, thanks. And Matt, what about you? What what drove the province to say, okay, let's achieve that, and what were the magic ingredients?
Well, the federal government's push with the reducing carbon and greenhouse gases that started. So in 2017, we had hired consultant Dunsky out of Montreal, and they did a report for us, and we adopted it as our PEI energy strategy, and it was a 10-year plan. So that was under the previous administration, and then the new administration under Premier Dennis King and Minister of Environment, Energy and Climate Action, Stephen Myers, the two of them have been just behind this 100%. So that's been driving it. Recommendations that I was part of the group that was making the recommendations to the previous administration and to this one. Some of them were getting pushed, some of them weren't, but under the new administration, they went beyond what we were actually recommending. So we were trying to try some things, and all of a sudden, no, we're going for this. And then in 2019, the Sustainable Transportation Action Plan, STAP here, was adopted, and that was a condensed version of the 10-year PI energy strategy that we had, with more specific targets laid out. And then in 2021, we adopted the Net Zero Carbon Act, and it had targets similar to the federal government's for the net zero energy in 2030 and the net zero emissions in 2040. Part of the STAP was also that the province has mandated that all purchases made by the provincial government shall be electric if there is an available product in whatever we need for. So cars for sure, trucks are now coming online, same with vans at some point, and maybe some of our heavier duty stuff afterwards, but school buses are the biggest things that we've done so far.
Wow, that's fantastic. So that shows how much some of maybe the top-down political wheel and top-down targets help drive those like underground targets. So that kind of answers that that third question that's on the screen, like how the existence of target help advance the transition. But maybe one question that's not there, but perhaps we could. I'd like to hear both of you a little bit more about is for those who are online, and you did mention that in your initial remarks about procurement. So could you tell us a little bit more how procurement work in your respective province to see if is it similar approaches, like who are the actors involved and what are some of the required steps? If we can hear you on that, that'd be interesting for the folks online. So maybe again, Matt, if you don't mind starting with this. Okay,
so traditionally, the Atlantic provinces have a procurement program. It's known as CAMIT. It's the Council of Atlantic Ministers of Education and Training. And that was used to purchase diesel buses. So if PEI wanted 38 diesel buses, we'd put our name on the list, and they'd put out a tender out for all 4 provinces, and we get that. Right now, the EV buses aren't part of that tender, but they are looking at adding it. It's just a little bit harder to put that into a tender document, as we found out over our 3 tenders that we've done so far. But aside from that, the Department of Education and the Department of Transportation, where I'm with, we usually have a joint submission that goes to the Treasury Board for funding, and also for permission to request funding from the federal government to join it in a program. So we might put a tender out while we're waiting for it, but nothing will get adopted or given approval until the Treasury Board has approved it themselves.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that. So on your end, David, well, obviously in BC, I'm guessing it's slightly different. There's not that Atlantic or provinces kind of a aligned procurement. So how does it work on your end in BC for the procurement?
Yeah, so in BC, the Association of School Transportation Services of BC, they secure standing offer prices for all types of buses, electric and diesel, and then actual orders are done by the schools themselves. And yeah, depending on if it's a public school or private school or Indigenous school, there's funding available that yeah, from either the Ministry of Education or the FNESC for First Nations schools. And yeah, essentially the school buses are ordered by the schools using the standing offers. And when the buses are delivered, the ministry, ASTSBC will, they will, yeah, sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused on the invoicing processes, but yeah, anyway, once the buses are delivered, then invoices are paid. But yeah, it's the ASTSBC that really helps the schools secure the buses.
Sorry, double mute. All right, thanks both for that, for answering those questions. So we'll move on to the third question, and so we'll focus a little bit more on the specifics of what's going on in your respective jurisdiction. So we'll start again with you, Matt, and PEI. There's the pilot for electric school bus charging at the bus drivers' homes, which is quite interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more why this pilot is important in the ESB transition, and how's it going so far?
Well, 85% of our present buses, the diesels, are parked at the driver's residence because of the rural area. It's hard to get bus drivers right now anyway, and this makes it cheaper for everybody involved. The bus driver doesn't have to drive to work. He's driving from there, and in most cases, the bus driver lives on the route, so there's no doubling back, things like that. If we started to move them away from that to a central location, we'd probably start losing bus drivers, which, as I mentioned, we're already having a shortage of. But after doing the first 2 or 3 phases where we put in bulk stations in the city of Charlottetown and Summerside, those 3 locations, it was rather expensive to put them in. And I thought that we could actually save some money by trying a couple of rural locations. Now, people were against it because they were, well, what if the bus driver leaves? What if this? What if that? So I come up with basically a portable system, and it looks permanent, but it's portable. It's only a 100 amp service. Each location has a plug in case a diesel bus is there for while the other one's in for repairs or for whatever reason, and then it has a light, and it's got its own service. So the bill comes directly to us. It's not being billed to the bus driver. So we did 2 in the spring of 2022, and we did both of them for under $5,000. Whereas you would think that when you put them in bulk, you'd save money, but when you put them in a mass charging site, the infrastructure is quite a bit more expensive. The infrastructure was anywhere from $18,000 to $35,000, depending on how much of the outside stuff you want to take into place, like the parking lot it is parked at, stuff like that, the school bus drivers' parking lot for their cars. Whereas we put them in for $5,000 to $10,000 at the bus driver's residence. In the $10,000 ones were the worst case ones, where we had to go underground with a power line for like 300 feet. They're really rural off the road. So if they had been right beside the road, we could have done it under 5,000 easy. The cost to remove one and relocate it is only $500 to $1,000. They're taking the product with us. So if the bus driver retires, gets sick long-term, or quits or gets fired, then we can pick it up. We've got an agreement signed with them to be able to go in and service it if it needs service, and to take it out if we want to. and we'd be abandoning the underground cable, which is the only loss. Rather than digging it up and ruin the yard, we'll just cut it off and bury it. As I mentioned, 85% of the fleet were to the driver's residences. So there's around 345 total, but we've got 15% spares. To operate the school bus driver's residence, the chargers are only 19.2 kilowatts. Our public utility has 20 kilowatts as the cutoff before you have to pay a demand fee. So when you have one alone, it'll never hit the demand meter penalty. It'll always be under. When you put two or more, as in a mass site, the bills are automatically almost doubled. So the electricity rate, or the electricity bill, for instance, for a bus for a month, an average one at the 3 mass locations was around $530 a month for the electricity. It was $830 for a diesel bus for that time, and it's around $400 for one at the bus driver's residence, which you have to take into account. The bus driver's residence and those diesel ones are all long range sites, whereas the ones that were at the depots, they're at the mass locations, they're shorter range, so they're not actually even using up as much electricity. A lot of that cost, if it wasn't for the demand cost, it would be lower than the one that's the residential ones. But the infrastructure for putting in is substantially for level 3 as well.
Yeah. Wow, thanks for sharing that. I'm trying hard to ask questions because I know we have to move on, but I'll still allow myself that. But do you feel that it's the same situation in other Atlantic Canada provinces in terms of that situation for where the bulk of the buses are parked at the driver's residence? So is that, in essence, what your pilot, is this something that other Atlantic provinces could learn from and certainly started thinking and implementing?
If they're in a similar state, but I can't say for sure, because I was surprised at the numbers that were parked at the bus driver's residence when I heard. And actually, I think some of our people at the top that were trying to get us to put mass charging sites all over the place for various reasons, but one was because they thought they wanted to save it, plus they're worried about bus drivers. They didn't realize, like, I had to really push. It took me 1.5 years to get us to try those two. Okay. And it was because everybody thought, oh no, it's going to be more expensive. There's no way you can do this. And it's just not helpful to us. Well, it actually helps. The public schools branch looks after the bus drivers, and they were 100% behind this.
Okay. Interesting. Super. Thanks for sharing that. Super interesting. All right. We'll move on to the other question focused around what's going on in BC. So, David, I know that in BC there are a number of funding programs to help provide support to school district and fleet operators that are hoping to get ESBs. Can you tell us a little bit more how these programs come about? Like, did they equally help accelerate the adoption of ESBs, or were a bit more helpful in a way? And how did they help accelerate the adoption of electric school buses?
Yeah, so there's really 4 programs that in some way either support ESBs themselves or provide funding for the infrastructure. So our primary program is called the Go Electric school bus program, and that provides funding for the buses, the level 2 chargers, as well as facility assessments. Then we also have the specialty use vehicle incentive program, which is just a vehicle rebate, and electric school buses are among the eligible vehicles on that program. And then we're also, we have the Go Electric Fleets program, which is providing infrastructure funding. And we're seeing through that program, electric school bus operators that may need fast charging, they would be able to secure funding through that program if they need more than just level 2s for their use case. And then we have the Commercial Vehicle Pilots program, and this is a medium heavy duty program, and it's supporting vehicles and infrastructure in pilot cases and with school bus pilot projects. Areas of interest would be like locations with below zero temperatures, having long distances, testing range, that sort of thing. The Go Electric public school bus program, that started in 2020, and that's been the main driver of electric school bus adoption, just because the program is being delivered by the ESBC, who also manage the procurement for buses in the province. So it's fairly simple for schools to apply for funding. They have to be pre-approved, and then they would get the funding on delivery of the vehicles. So that program and it being delivered with ASTSBC is the main driver in accelerating, and having that direct funding for the facility assessments, the level 2 chargers, and the buses themselves. And it's open to all schools, public, private, Indigenous schools. So
that's great. And that's one of the things, I mean, not being an expert, but having learned a lot more in the last few years about ESBs and any program, I guess you mentioned something that was key, it's a little bit more simple. And I guess it kind of is a one-stop shop in terms of that specific funding program, because the entity that's responsible for procurement is also provide that support for that program. So that's super interesting. Maybe just another follow-up question for you, and maybe even Matt, if that applies. So how do these programs address inequalities in the rollout of ESBs? Like, we know that in the States, there's a similar coalition working on electrification of school buses adoption, and they're trying to also very much consider most vulnerable population that may not always have access to some of those programs, or school boards that may not have access. So how is that taken into consideration into some of those programs for you out there in BC, David?
Yeah, like it's important that we're like providing the opportunities for electric school buses in all areas of BC, and for all schools, Indigenous, public, private. So the program's designed in a way to we're collecting data on the actual bus performance and sharing total cost of ownership information with schools, so that they can assess like if the schools, if the buses will fit well for their use case. And I think as we get more data, we've had buses on the road now for a while, we'll be able to make the case and build confidence in more remote areas, in Indigenous locations where there's not high adoption. So it's really just building like the evidence that these school buses can work throughout BC.
Thanks for sharing that. Matt, did you want to add to this, or is that something that's considered as well in your neck of the woods?
I don't think it really applies for us, because our Department of Education owns all of the buses for the 2 school boards that we have here, the English and the French language school boards. Another part of it is that even though we're the smallest province, we're the most densely populated province. You can't go anywhere for a kilometer and not bump into somebody or a house. Not a whole lot of us here, but we're spread out over the province.
I gotcha. I hear you. Maybe to wrap up on this question, going back to you, David, like you mentioned that sorry, I'm going to go back to the Go Electric School Bus Program, which started in 2020, and it's the main driver. What's the next step for that? Is there continuous fund through this program, or do you see that it's still going to be the main driver in the future?
Yeah, there's still funding in the program, and there's other, I guess, more recently, like the low carbon fuel standard in BC, that's helping to improve the business case for fleet operators who can earn credits for charging their school buses. So yeah, the electric school bus program is definitely the driver right now for school buses, and you know, as there's still funding, it will continue to be.
Great, thanks for that. All right, we'll move on to our fifth question for both of you about the challenges and barriers, and I'm sure many on the call will be very interested in hearing more. I think we did hear some of it already. For example, in terms of what you were saying, that where like the school buses are like essentially parked where the bus drivers are, so that is certainly a challenge. So it's, in essence, the question is like, what are the most prominent challenges and barriers for ESB adoption in each of your provinces? I know, Matt, you did mention that some of the regulation and policy at the provincial level and even at the federal did help drive. So like, what are some then of the challenges and barriers that you face in making it happen? Is it more technical? Is it more practical? So
well, since we started this during COVID, supplies was a big deterrent. We actually waited a year for pieces of equipment to install for the chargers. That affected the school buses themselves. Were having issues with getting their supply lines to get the buses to us. Those were the biggest things that we've had issues with over the last 3 years. There's been other things, but because we're the first ones doing this, we can't call or Google help. Little things like even trying to get our Department of Education to tell, or I should say Public Schools branch, to tell us how many buses do you need. Like, give us the future, what's the maximum you can picture in the next 10 years for a certain area. Well, I wasn't involved with that first 12 that started here, but when we added the next 35, I was told, okay, one of these sites, the max we're ever going to need is 24. Well, I put in 30 anyway, and 30 isn't enough. So they've since come back, oh, there's more and more. Now, we will get rid of that issue because there's a brand new high school being built close, which is going to pull some of those buses away to that new school. But the biggest issue is that. Then dealing with charger and bus companies, they're salesmen. So you have to take everything that you hear with a grain of salt. So a 150-kilometer range bus is 130. A 200-kilometer range bus is 170. If you have electric heat on your bus, that can lower it by as much as 40% in the wintertime if you're using electric heat. All our buses use diesel heat. There's diesel heaters in the bus, and that's kind of bothered some people when they see, oh, electric bus, and it's got an exhaust pipe coming out of the back of it. But if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to use them in our situation. Great, if you have a really short range, that's not an issue, but for the most part, ours was settled by going with the diesel heaters.
Thanks for sharing that. It's super interesting and to take into consideration. And again, not being an expert here, I do wonder if the improvement of technology, as we see in private smaller vehicles, will apply, of course, in the coming years to ESB to improve the range. So, David, are some of those challenges similar to you in BC in terms of the supply chain and even the reality of the charging infrastructure or the bus capacity for range?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that supply chain has been like a huge barrier, or like it's definitely a factor. I think for everyone. But yeah, building off of what Matt said, just there's still hesitancy in a lot of areas in BC due to the uncertainties about range on certain vehicles. And that's not like exclusively, I guess, a electric school bus issue. I think in BC, like with the wide variety of different geographies and climates, just in general, there's there's range anxiety in a lot of the more remote areas in BC. So that like certainly applies to electric school buses as well. And you know, in school districts that are that may have like longer routes, we're not like going to see the same adoption as we do in more populated cities. So that's still a barrier, and one of the reasons why we're wanting to look at the actual performance data from the buses themselves. I would say a barrier has just been the amount of funding available. Like at the time when schools are making orders, like they have competing budget priorities, and so just the higher, you know, upfront cost of an electric school bus, that's a barrier. And you know, even though like we've done work on like total cost of ownership, and you know, over the lifetime of an electric school bus, it's a win for the schools. It's that upfront cost, and that's still it's still a barrier even with the existing funding levels. So yeah, and the other thing I'll mention, I think, is, you know, we have it's a large province, so electric school bus maintenance is another thing that's on the mind of schools and districts. And you know, if there's an issue with the vehicle, like how quickly can they access services for their bus? How much does that cost? It's different location to location in BC. So I would say those are kind of the primary barriers at this time.
Thanks, David and Matt, for those. So that blends well into this other question about, like, well, sure, government support for one thing, but maybe we can expand on that, because the kind of question I had here is like, what kind of targets or programs, policy, or financial support, as you just alluded to, David, from the federal government, maybe particularly to start with, especially given the CESBA's national federal scope, of course, of work. What kind of those would be most helpful to help achieve either your targets or what you're trying to achieve in terms of ESB adoption? So again, maybe starting with you, David, and back to Matt.
Yeah, I think targets are something that would be great to see. And as I mentioned earlier, like we have our consultation paper out about medium and heavy duty ZEV regulation, and that's building off of the targets that we have for light duty vehicles. Like by 2035, having 100% of sales in BC will be zero emission vehicles. So I think targets are a useful tool, and having something concrete. The other thing I would say, there's like the Zero Emission Transit Fund, and that funding is great. I think, you know, if there's going to be more support from the federal government, I think having like programs that align a little bit better with the provincial procurement process, maybe smaller scale programs or would be helpful. Yeah, and beyond that, I think there's still great, like there's the Canadian Infrastructure Bank program that is helpful as well. So yeah, I think targets are something that can really push provinces to adopt, and that would be helpful.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit more on the CIB program, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank program, for those who might not be as familiar with it? I know I'm not as familiar.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's just a loan program that people can access for zero emission vehicle, like medium heavy duty vehicles. With you know, to be honest, I don't know off the top of my head. I believe it's zero interest rate, but don't quote me on that. So Matt, if you know off the top of your head, jump in and save me. But yeah, I know it is a program that schools are looking to access, particularly, like I said, with the upfront cost being so much higher for electric school buses.
Great, thanks. So I'll let a chance for Matt to maybe comment on that, but also I'm curious to hear about your thoughts as well. What we've heard from David in terms of, that alignment between federal programs and provincial programs. Is that also something that you'd like to see more of? But maybe start with the CIB, sorry, not CIBC, CIB, if you can, and then.
Well, for us, we use the federal program Investing in Canadian Infrastructure, ISIP, and we've used that for everything up till now, including that 25 buses that is presently waiting for approval. But we've totally exhausted our allocation of that fund now. There's 3 or 4 more years left of the fund, but we've used it up, our allocation. But there might be some other dollars in that fund that we're using for something else that we've allocated. But
that ISIP was really broad, right? It was
yes.
Infrastructure as a whole, and was pretty big for municipalities as well. Yeah. Okay.
And then we're looking at switching to the Zero Emissions Transit Fund, which David mentioned. The only thing is dealing with that, it's not being user friendly. So as David said, having something closer aligned to what the funding is for, or a smaller dedicated group to it, would be a lot better. If it's dedicated for EV school or transit buses, that'd be ideal, because they're asking us for a development plan when we already have 25% of our fleet converted using federal funds from another program. So having to provide them with all this background information and forward thinking, that we've already gone through that. Like it's kind of going backwards in our case. And the group that looks after our funding, I'm not sure if they've looked at the banking format or not, David. I know that they've been trying to chase down anything to pick up to replace the funding that we've had up until now for the next 4 years of our commitment for 25 buses a year. I know that right now we're only looking at the Zero Emissions Transit Fund, but I'm sure we're going to be looking at a bunch of other programs if they come out or as they come out.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Thank you both actually for answering those questions, and this is very useful. So we'll move on in light of the time as well to another question for you. Actually, I've got this and then another one before we actually start opening up, and I can see there's already some great questions in the question platform. So on this one, so obviously you're leaders in this particular field of ESB, if I can call it a field of ESB adoption in your respective provinces. We've established that already. So based on some of those successes that you've shared with us and you've had thus far, like what are some of the key advice that you'd want to share with elected officials, policymakers, advocate in other provinces, like some of whom may be listening today as well? So anything you'd like to share based on your experiences? So this time maybe we'll start with you, Matt.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, trying to get the numbers that you need up front will help, because going back into a location a second and a third time at a mass charging location is quite expensive. It was expensive to begin with, and you could possibly double your costs by going in again and trying to add to it later. Some of the things you can't, so you're actually doubling or tripling some of your efforts. If you know your ranges as well for your bus routes, if all your buses are in a pool that are used for short and long ranges, don't waste what you think you're saving on getting some lower range buses. If they're all in the same pool, it's just going to create headaches for the future. Go for the long range and use them for the whole pool. Switch them around if you want to save the life on them. But it's different if you have a pool of buses that are always going to be dedicated to a shorter range. Then great, you can go for the shorter range. But in our case, our first tender was for the 150 kilometer range buses. And some of them were wheelchair buses, which were going to go rurally. So we actually ended up having to ask the bus supplier to come in and add the last battery to it to extend the range of the wheelchair buses, which were going to a rural area. So adding it later is more expensive than if it was on the bus to begin with. Level 2 charging. Our first 42 buses were all level 2 capable only. All the buses since then are level 2 and level 3. Charging your bus at its home base with the level 2 charger overnight is by far the cheapest cost. Infrastructure is less than half than level 3 charging. And the level 3 charging, when you get to the rural locations, it no longer allows you to have the savings of that demand meter, because the level 3 charger, even the lowest one, puts it right into the demand fee. So you're doubling your electricity bill forever. A couple of other issues for the level 3 are the, like if right now all of our main locations that are mass charging units, they're all level 2. It would cost us more than triple to update that whole system to accommodate level 3 chargers, and that's just the lowest level 3 charger. So that ours are 19.2 kilowatt level 2. The lowest level 3 is a 25 kilowatt, and it only charges a bus 1.2 times faster. A level 3 charger that's higher, 100 kilowatts and above, they will actually charge your buses significantly faster, but it depends on the bus. Our buses, for instance, have 400 volt batteries in the architecture. The standard is 800. So we're limited with only being able to charge them with a level 3 charger at 53 kilowatt, 55 kilowatt. That's the max they can take at a time. But when they switch over, which the buses are now switching over to the 800 volt, it can actually charge at 4 and 5 to 6 times faster. And it'll be able to take everything 100 kilowatt, 120, 150 kilowatt charger can give it. The level 3 chargers help as a safety net because you can use them for extending the range of a bus that's used for extracurricular activities. So like after hours, it's going on a school basketball, soccer trip, or for whatever reason. Once it gets to the other location, most of our buses would not be able to go and do that. But if we had a level 3 charger that could charge it quickly and bring it back, then that's the way to go. But that we're not talking about the low level 3 charger. We're talking about a larger level 3 charger. And the level 2 chargers can only put out 15 kilometers of range per hour of charge, 15 to 16.
Wow. That's quite an eye-opening. Thanks for that. And before I turn to David, anything you could share, Matt, on terms of based on your success for other people in other jurisdictions to advance this same work in terms of the policy work? I mean, I know you mentioned that right from the get-go that there was that kind of the federal drive that helped, the provincial drive with some elected officials championing this. Like, would you say like any words on that in particular? Did you have to further convince some of those policymakers to help out, or was it a little bit more natural, given there was a kind of a quote unquote natural willingness towards that work? Like, what would you say for others that might be in a different situation?
That was for Matt.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was for Matt. There's a follow-up.
And I thought that was for David.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of David, but I know, Matt, in terms of your situation, so, as you said, he kind of had that support from the get-go, but is this something that you still need to work on, or maybe not as much, or what advice would you have for others that are?
Well, for us right now, because we've got the backing of the provincial government, the biggest blockade is funding. And just like David said, it's a high upfront cost for this. And using all the things that I just mentioned to try to eliminate the wastage, which we could have. And like, if you went and put a level 3 charger in level 3 charging infrastructure, you don't realize right off the bat that you're spending so much more money for that infrastructure, and you've got a permanent higher bill at the end of the day for charging. And those are two significant ongoing costs. Great, your upfront cost for the bus was one thing, but you could put it back right up into the diesel fuel costs area if you want to go too far. That was my big concern, is that you don't want to waste any money, but because we've already got the backing, the It's more the programs, the federal funding. If it wasn't there, we wouldn't be as far along as we are, for sure, because of just the outright cost of it.
Thanks for that, Matt. Appreciate this. Now to you, David, like similar question again. What sort of advice would you like to share, with folks on the line, of course, but with elected officials as well, policymakers in other provinces that are looking into what you're doing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for funding. Like, as we've mentioned many times, the upfront cost is a barrier. So, but kind of building off what Matt's talking about with the charging infrastructure and all the considerations for that, like maybe providing funding for facility assessments so that schools are able to understand kind of what their charging requirements would be based on their specific use cases. Yeah, as Matt's talked about, and as is the truth, the use case for buses differs depending on, you know, what school they're working in, what district. So yeah, some will not need level 3, some might. And yeah, I guess understanding like what the demand charge rates are in your province, it's a little different in BC than it is in PEI. So factoring that into whatever facility assessment is being done. I would say one thing we've tried to do is share the total cost of ownership over the lifetime of the vehicle compared to diesel buses. So to look into ways to model that and share that information and build the business case for electric school buses by factoring in the funding into those calculations. So yeah, I would say that. And I think what we're looking at doing right now, as I've mentioned, is looking at performance data to help inform, like, you know, where electric school buses are feasible and identify barriers and challenges that are occurring for buses on the road right now. So maybe try and, you know, create plans to collect data, work with the school bus manufacturers or charging networks. Just try and establish a way to collect data. I think it's useful, and, you know, hopefully there's opportunities to share data, like across provinces and whatnot in the future. And if there are, then that'll be helpful for everyone.
That's great, and thanks for that. That's actually a perfect segue for that last question to you both about what are some of the next steps for the ESB transition in your province. So, David, you were just mentioning about, you know, looking at performance data. I think in Ontario, some groups are looking into that as well. I think folks from Pollution Pro certainly. So yeah, could you extend a little bit more? And that'll be our last question before we open it up to the floor, to those of you who have put question in the question section. Thanks again for that. So what are some of those next steps on your end? So we'll start out west this time again with you, David. So you mentioned about more information about performance data. Is there anything else that you're seeing coming up next, or that you're hoping for, if you're not seeing it, you're part of the wish list?
Yeah, I think, you know, we want to see like the continued support funding wise, and yeah, collecting the performance data, looking at that and seeing how it can help with you know, encouraging ESB adoption. And I think right now, like I mentioned earlier in the call, that we have that consultation paper out for the medium heavy duty ZEV targets and regulations. So that's kind of the next step, is assessing the, you know, feedback that comes from that, and to see how that informs you know, potential targets or legislation. So yeah, I would point anyone interested to look on our website at that consultation paper, and look at like the proposed medium heavy duty annual sales targets. I think that's kind of where we're sitting right now, and yeah, that's
great. Maybe quickly, and apologies if you mentioned that earlier on, but what's the timeline with the consultation paper on your end?
The consultation period ends June 26th, and then the feedback will continue to be looked at, and work will be done on those results.
Great, thanks, David. So to you, Matt, in PI, so what are some of the next steps you're looking into, or something that you're hoping for? I mean, you mentioned performance data, certainly funding. What's on your plate?
In the next couple of weeks, we're trying to get a quick turnaround approval from Treasury Board. We're submitting a request. I'm not sure how the school boards are other places, but ours, our breakdown for our high schools, they refer to all the family of schools as all the feeder schools in each one. So they're typically in the same area. So what we're planning on doing is adding a level 3 charger at the school, at each one of the high schools across the province, for each family, as well as 2 level 2 chargers like the ones that are at the bus drivers' homes. The level 3 charger will, as I mentioned earlier, will enable us to use the EV buses for extracurricular activities, at least use them for some more than what we can right now. We have the 2 level 2 chargers, partly because the first 42 buses we have only take level 2 chargers. And if we have a bus driver at home where his charger's not working, or his bus isn't working, or he's sick and a temporary driver comes in, and that person needs somebody to charge the bus, we can use the high school in the center of the area on a short-term area. We'll have 2 chargers there just in case as a backup. Last year we did have, like, we told our school boards, don't use the EV buses for extracurricular activity. We had one that went out after doing its route at the end of the day, drove 50 some kilometers. Got to remember, this bus was only going to have 170 to begin with. He's already done his route in the afternoon. He drove 50 some kilometers from Summerside to Charlottetown and dropped the kids off for a rugby game. Realized that he only had 38% charge left. Drove 10 more kilometers to get to our depot to charge for 45 minutes. And as I mentioned, our level 2 chargers only give 15 kilometers of range per hour. So by the time he got back to the school, he was down to 32%. So he loaded the kids, drove it to the depot, switched to a diesel bus, drove back to Summerside, and came back and got the electric bus fully charged in the morning. So we're trying to avoid things like that. If we had a level 3 charger at the high school there, he could have done that easily with the bus. He could have just stayed at the school, charged it for an hour and a half, and would have almost been fully charged. So that's our next level, and we're hoping to get a quick turnaround to start doing it. We originally were going to start installing level 2 chargers everywhere, realizing now that we don't want to go in twice. So a level 3 charger is a big ask, because the level 3 charger that we're looking at is going to be $200,000 plus each. The level 2 chargers are substantially less. We're looking at around $10,000 or $12,000 to install them at the school.
Wow. Well, thanks to you both, Matt and David, for sharing those excellent insights with us on this call today. Very much appreciated. And throughout the call, we had a number of questions. I think I could see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those. So if you don't mind, we'll go through some of that. So I'll start with the first one that came in there. There's no particular vote in terms of what seemed most popular. So we should have time to go through all of them. So Elisa, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, is asking, how have you engaged First Nation in the electric school bus transition? Now, I know, David, you alluded to some of that when I was asking you about making sure that some most vulnerable pockets of population, maybe how can we maybe service with those electric school buses. So any one of you would like to give it a go in terms of how you've engaged First Nation in ESB transition?
Yeah, I can kind of take a stab at kind of, I guess, elaborating on like how we're supporting First Nations. So like with the Go Electric School Bus program, we've earmarked a certain amount of funding specifically for the private schools and the First Nations. So that's, you know, one thing we're doing to, you know, help assist with that transition. In terms of specific engagement, like I'm not sure if I think there's going to be another panel with Frank from ASTSBC, and he would be a good person to talk to. He's more on the ground in terms of the communications with all different schools in BC. But yeah, I could follow up. Like, feel free to email me if you want to discuss this further.
Thanks. And maybe if I can ask our colleagues at CESBA if indeed Frank from ACSBC is going to be in one of the upcoming events, if you don't mind putting it in the chat room so people can maybe tune into that. And thanks for that, David. Matt, did you want to jump in on this at all?
It really doesn't come into play here since, except for the two locales that have a school for the younger kids, but for the most part, they're on the same school bus routes and go to attend all the regular schools that are in the province already. And it's a shared bus, even the one that they do use. So it's all part of the same school bus system, and it'll get changed at the same rate and time as the rest of them. Whenever that bus is worn out, it'll be replaced with an EV bus.
Great, thanks. So this next question is specifically for you, Matt. Chris asked, and it was earlier at the beginning of our conversation, three things. Did you say first that the province mandated electric school buses, which I think we've already answered, but the second one is, are you prohibited from buying diesel? And the third one, would you have bought electric school buses without federal funding? So, yeah.
So in 2017, I actually was given permission to approach a school bus company just to buy one or two to do as a trial. And based upon the questions that we were asking, it never came to fruition. Like, give us a location where there's some other buses used in the Northern Hemisphere. And all we got was California, Georgia. And I said, no, I want some information from somebody who owns one that's in a cold weather climate. And we never got any responses, so it kind of fell through. So we did try to do some on our own. We would not be buying this level of buses if it wasn't for federal funding, for sure. We still might have a couple, but we would not have 82 buses right now with plans to buy another 25 immediately. But we're definitely all for it with the federal funding because it brings it closer to in line with the diesel buses. The mandate from the province is that every vehicle we buy from now on, if it's available, shall be electric. So we've been really under the gun to try to get enough EV buses to us. Back in 2008, we had an issue where our whole fleet of diesel buses, or I shouldn't say all of them, but the majority of them wouldn't pass inspection due to rust. So we had to replace our whole fleet within 2 years. And because of that issue popping up, the province adopted a policy that your bus can only stay on the road for 12 years. And then if it's still in good enough condition, it can be used as a spare for 2 years. So at 14 years, no matter what, it's end of life. You have to replace it. So if you do the math, last year, we should have replaced almost all of our buses. Now, we were rather aggressively trying to get that number, but there's not enough out there. So we're playing with our supply line of buses. We're spending a ton of money trying to keep them on the road. The diesel buses, it's not, the diesel part is fine. It's the frame. So at the year 2000, or at the end of the 12th year, we're spending $40,000 on the bus just to keep it going a couple more years for the frame to get rid of the rust. They completely strip it down. It's a rather in-depth thing, and then repair anything welding and paint it again and get it back on the road.
Maybe if I can piggyback on that, would it be a similar issue with a diesel bus?
No, that's what I mean. So those are, you mean electric?
Yeah, sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Yes, so
yeah, sorry.
We're waiting to see that because it's the same frame. So we're going to have the same issue with that. It's going to rust out just like a diesel bus did. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we're an island surrounded by salt water, and that our red soil, heavy in iron. Everything we do, salting the roads, even though we've got one of the better managed systems where we limit it as much as possible, it's still on the roads. And then the buses sit parked in the summer over grass, and that doesn't, the dew helps rust the frames as well.
Great, thanks. All right, we're from the ocean shore. We're going to go to the mountains of BC to you, David. There's a question from Mike asking if BC you notice a range reduction on the buses negotiating the mountain roads. Is that an issue for maybe on your end?
Yeah, that is an issue. Like the elevation changes on the road in more mountainous areas definitely, require more power to drive, and the range is reduced compared to driving flat. And additionally, like there's the colder weather, which affects battery performance as well. So yeah, both of those factors do affect the range of all battery electric vehicles. So that's one of the reasons why we're so interested in performance data. In my ministry, we want to see exactly what the performance in these locations is like.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we'll be able to cover the last three questions that we've got here. This one is from Reshma. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Reshma was reading about the Canadian Infrastructure Bank last night for electric school buses, and asking, do school bus operators engage with this? Reshma says no, that school boards don't. What's your experience on your end? So maybe start with David and maybe Matt.
Yeah, so I do know that school bus, I'm not so sure if it would be the operators, the districts are I guess have challenges accessing CIB, and it would be nice to see more uptake in CIB in BC. I don't think we're seeing a lot. It's not something that like I'm personally aware of, and the folks at ASTS BC could probably better answer that question in terms of what other sources of funding, or I guess CIB specifically, where that's being utilized.
Did you want to, thanks, David. Did you want to add something, Matt, on this?
It doesn't really apply to us because we're just operated all by the school board, or I should say public schools branch.
Gotcha. All right.
As a sub-part of Department of Education.
Great, thanks. Thank you both. So I think this next one may be more for you, Matt, but of course, David, feel free to jump in afterwards. This is from Mark, who's asking if you have a sense of what proportion of the buses that are parked at the driver's home location needs to be charged in between runs to complete the afternoon run? Do you have a sense of that?
So to provide perspective, the ones that are at the mass locations, most of those buses return from their routes in the morning, the urban runs, and they've still got 60 to 70% of their charge left. So they could actually go out and do their evening run, no problem, without charging. But we charge them anyway, so that they're back up to 90 to 100%. But the rural ones, there's a large range, because even though it's rural, some of the buses are really close to the school, and they still have a short range, even though they're rural. But the longer ones, yes, they're hard pressed to get through. Even though we've given them the 200-kilometer range buses, they'll be hard pressed to get in without charging at some point during the morning and the afternoon, like in between their two routes. I mentioned earlier that they're switching to a newer bus battery, 800-volt system. With the adoption of that, they're hoping to get back the 250-kilometer range. Our supplier had, just before we bought our buses, they used to have three options: 150, 200, and 250, which is 3 batteries, 4 batteries, and 5 batteries. When they switched to a new battery supplier, the batteries were too heavy, too large, and the weight was too much of an issue. They couldn't put the 5th battery back in. So with this new battery that they're going to be producing themselves, it will have the capability of holding more charge, in which case they're hoping to get back up to the 250 even with only 4 batteries. That's the hope anyway, in which case if we have a 250 range, that'll meet all of our buses locations, rural or otherwise, at least for their daily routes. Still not prime for use afterwards for extracurricular activity without that level 3 charge boost to get back home.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. David, I don't know, did this apply, or did you want to provide anything else on this, or?
Yeah, we don't have like the same like home parking charging pilot, but yeah, it really just depends on the use case, and that's why we're funding like the fleet assessments, is so that the routes that these buses are driving are the infrastructure that schools are buying is appropriate for them, and again, like the buses and battery size that's being purchased is appropriate. So that's yeah, I wouldn't be able to provide like a proportion.
Great, thank you for that. So there's one more question that I added up to the chat. So so we have 2 questions left, and we'll really wrap it up with those 2. So thanks for all of you who've put questions in. Because of time, we won't be able to take any more. So the second to last is from Emily, asking if you could describe any outreach you did with drivers in the efforts for electric school bus transition. Anyone would like to jump in first?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. So yeah, when an electric school bus is delivered to a school, like generally there's going to be training either provided by the bus manufacturer themselves, or you know, in partnership with the ASTSBC, like the bus manufacturers in partnership with the ASTSBC. So the drivers will be able to, you know, try the buses, learn the differences, and get training so that they can use the buses. And yeah, there's people, I know there's stories of drivers who are very hesitant to switch and not wanting to switch, but after using the buses for a while, they prefer them. It's a better drive. So yeah, essentially, yeah, there is training to help with that transition.
Great, thanks. What about you, Matt? Is there be something on your end?
Our training is similar when it comes in, but I recommend it right from the start. Get the bus drivers that are behind this first. Give it to them. Give it to somebody who's interested and wants one. Because if you give it to somebody who doesn't want one and is reluctant to drive one, it's not going to go well. I guarantee you that bus won't charge. It'll have issues, whether it was really an issue or whether it was forced. Because once they see that their co-workers are happy with the buses that they've had, then it's a lot easier to push them to get them to take the buses.
Great, thanks. All right, this last question is from Sina, and again, apologies if I mispronounce your name. I think we've partly addressed that, at least in the case of Matt. The question is, what's your plan to charge the school buses that sometimes travel out of their regular service block, exempt for summer camp. So Matt, you were addressing that earlier on about the range issue, and I think it was for the football or rugby game. Sorry, I can't remember. Are you relying on level 3 or public infrastructure, or having some spare level 2 chargers for unpredicted trips? So I guess, Matt, you sort of answered that, and maybe we can revisit that a little bit, and David, you can contribute as well. So
yes, so the intent is to get level 3 chargers at the high schools to help out, but it's being under discussion too to give them a pass card to use at the public stations that are level 3s. We have very few level 3 public stations in the province, and for the most part, they were set up for tourists. Like we've got them at the 2 locations where you can arrive to PEI by the bridge or by the ferry, which isn't really a prime location for a bus to charge, especially the one that's at the ferry, which is closed for 4 months out of the year. But we do have a couple that are in prime locations, but there's only 1 or 2 charges. So the school bus could go there, and it could be behind 2 vehicles. So that's not really practical. It would be different if it was like in the future sometime when there's a bank of 10 level 3 chargers somewhere to pull up to. Yeah, we could do that. That's why we're trying to put these ones at the high schools to accommodate it. But as David mentioned, the range that you have and the issues with the local area because of hills and things like that, because they kill the battery, you definitely will have to keep a diesel bus for some of those areas for quite a while yet. Every jurisdiction is going to be different, but we're probably a little bit an easier one to meet. But we did a couple of bus drives where we sent them out into the on a really cold day, sent them out this was before we had rural routes done, and they took a drive out for as far as they could, and they came back. Well, they came back against the wind. They simulated stops and everything, and when they came back against the wind, the charge was depleting faster than the bus would recognize it was.
Sorry, trouble with the mute button. Thanks for that, Matt. Maybe so to you, David. What's your take on this on these questions?
Yeah. I don't really have much to add on that. Like, I guess it's kind of a building off of the previous questions, but yeah, we wouldn't rely on level 3. Like, just like Matt said, it's not practical. Yeah, and you know, even if you could guarantee a spot at a level 3 station, some of them, like the sites, are just not designed to accommodate vehicles this large or long. So yeah, that it's not really in the picture for these use cases.
Great. Well, thanks to you both for answering these questions, and I also want to thank every one of you out there who took the time to ask those questions and to tune in today. But first, I'll thank you both, David and Matt, for taking your time for being with us today and answering those questions, my questions and those that the folks had online. It's very, very informative, very much appreciated, and it's great to hear your not just the stories, but the progress, the lessons learned, and what we can take away from this. So very much appreciate. Thank you to both of you. So we're coming to the end of our session. Of course, again, I want to thank both our panelists for their contribution today. That was great. Just also a reminder that this was recorded, so I think it should be made available soon to all of you, and to those of you who you have in mind you feel would be interested by this topic. Of course, we encourage you to stay in touch with CESBA by visiting the online resource library that can be found at eschoolbusalliance.ca. You can join the bi-monthly newsletter. You can follow the coordinating organizations that are Équiterre in Green Communities Canada on social media to find out a lot more about this fantastic work. We'll be sending out a post-event appreciation survey along with the recording. So as I was mentioning about the recording a minute ago, so of course we'd really appreciate your feedback to help us improve on future sessions. And as I was mentioning from the beginning, this is a series of 4 events that are happening online. There are 2 more sessions that will be taking place next week, including advocating, sorry, I can never pronounce that word properly, advocating for electric school bus adoption in key provinces. That will be on June 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And the last one, operating electric school buses from coast to coast, taking place on June 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as well. So we certainly hope that you can join us for those conversations to hear from other electric school bus leaders from across the country. Again, my name is Jean-Patrick Toussaint at the Trottier Family Foundation, and was very happy to be with you today. I really thank you for being here. I also want to thank Équiterre and Green Communities Canada for organizing these sessions. On this, you'll have 4 minutes left to your day. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. Bye-bye.